I am really excited for our latest elder law interview where I interviewed Damon Wenig. He is the National FET and Preneed Director here at Krause Financial. And during our conversation, which I thought was really interesting, he talks about the costs associated with funerals. And then he talks about some different spend down options using funeral expense trust in crisis planning, and then also the opportunity for the attorney to be involved with setting up some pre-need funeral and burial planning and making sure that those plans that you can work with your clients on a proactive Medicaid plan can be properly funded. Then we kind of pivot and we talk a little bit about how the funeral professional and the elder law attorney can work together for the benefit of their clients in making sure that their decisions are properly implemented once the client passes away. So please join me for our latest elder law interview with Damon Wenig. So, Damon, you kind of want to introduce yourself and define what the death care industry is generally?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, um, my name's Damon Wenig. I serve here at Krause as our National Director of Funeral Expense Trust and Pre-Need. So there we have that. But really, that just means that I get to educate, equip, and resource individuals um, around funeral products and funeral planning and what that means. So helping oversee and just add some momentum to these important products. The death care industry is really anything that involves funeral homes, cemeteries, crematories, and pre-planning of funeral services. So it kind of comprises all of those different elements. I come from the death
Yeah,
care industry, which I feel like there needs to be like some sort of music that goes in the background when I say that, but really it just it's,
Morticia playing it in the background
yeah,
on the organ.
absolutely, absolutely. We're a lot less frightening. You know, there's a lot of attorney jokes, there's a lot of funeral director jokes too,
I'm
so
sure.
the banter could go back and forth all day, but, I my father and I actually own funeral homes in the, Wisconsin area, a group of funeral homes, and as well as a pre-planning group, really spending time, talking and discussing about, offering products for consumers around these important topics of funeral planning. So that's what I get to do as well here with Kraus, and it's awesome to connect talking a little bit about that. It's funny when people say, "What are you passionate about?" And I'm like, "Funeral planning." I feel like people's eyes just gloss over, but that's the truth.
Yeah, and I think your experience is really cool. Do you want to talk about, and this is kind of because I just think it's really interesting, your hands on the ground experience in the funeral home. What did you do on a day-to-day basis, managing those funeral homes, and were you working with bodies? Like, what was
Yeah,
your kind
yeah,
of day-to-day? Just because I think it's really interesting more than anything.
absolutely. So I am a licensed funeral director and embalmer. So for those of you, yeah, for those of you who don't know, funeral service is made of, and they call them three quadrants of the funeral service professional. One would be what some people would think of as a mortician, so handling the deceased remains at the time of death, transferring them into the care, but also the preparation. So whether that's cremation, whether that's embalming, and preparing them for final disposition. Of course, there's a lot of medical, legal, there's a lot of pathological components to that of caring for the body in a respectful but also safe manner. The other is obviously the funeral services portion. So the actual event, caring for the emotional needs of the individual, tending to some of the, I'll say, more soft side, the counseling side of funeral service. Then there's also this other component that not a lot of people think about, and that's more of the either the business or the legal component that we're dealing with people's estates, contracts, selling of merchandise and goods, even the actual physical body and its quasi property state. Well, I think we'll talk a little bit about
Yeah,
that perhaps later. But those are kind of the quadrants of what makes up the death care professional. So that means that every day our day was so different
right.
because some days I would be navigating this or that, but oftentimes it was helping lead our family firms, and then also specifically around advanced planning, which is what we're talking about today.
Yeah, and that connects so well with the elder law attorney and thinking of broader issues with somebody's kind of last quarter of life as they're going through that, how to make that quality of life as high as possible. And then also when they pass away, making sure that the family is ready for that and there's a structure and a plan so that it doesn't become a crisis and there's not a whole lot of work to do at that point so the family can grieve appropriately and obviously celebrate the life of their loved ones. But I think one thing that I know that I was not aware of until you taught me about them is some of the costs associated with that end of life, with the funeral, with that whole process. Can you talk a little bit about what costs are associated that you were working with?
Yeah, so generally speaking, I think right now the statistic is the National Funeral Director Association statistic is around $7,800 for the average funeral cost. But what it is like to make sure that people understand is that is the funeral home portion of the cost. And really, there's this larger umbrella that we oftentimes associate funeral costs being with, and that would be cemetery expenses, obituaries, flowers, you name it. I mean, funeral services have changed and morphed as fast as culture has, and what has become valuable and important to people is continuing to change. Generally speaking, that means that most funeral costs are between 17 and probably even 15,000, meaning that there's some scale that goes less than that, of course, for more of a direct disposition. Likely that would be a cremation with no services, just the cremated remains returned to the family. But that also means that there's an element that we've definitely done services that are 25, $30,000 because again, everyone always asks me, Damon, how much does a funeral cost?
Right.
And I always say, well, how much does a house cost? Well, it depends.
Lawyer's
What do
favorite
you
term is it depends.
yeah. Yeah, exactly. How much does a car cost? Well, are we talking a Prius or a Maserati? Because they're both cars, right? So there's a lot of wiggle room in there, but that might give a general overarching view.
Excellent. So when you're talking about planning, funeral planning, what can a family do as far as what does an actual funeral plan look like?
Yeah. So funeral plans are interesting because they can be as detailed and involved as one would want, or they can be very general and broad. Some people view funeral planning as simply setting aside funds that are irrevocably marked and protected from medical assistance if they would ever need to go into Medicaid, and they consider that funeral planning. That's good and well. Some people view funeral planning as involving a little bit more directives or protection, um, ensuring that final wishes are actually carried through. And other people get real nitty gritty and talk about, I want this song sung. I want these funeral potatoes. It's always the funeral potatoes,
Love the
right?
funeral potatoes.
I'm a big advocate, big fan. So it really depends. Of course, funeral services are not only very regional in methods of disposition, but they're also very specific to one's culture and or faith background. So you're going to have a lot of interconnectivity there. Um, Generally speaking, the funeral practitioner, the funeral provider, handles a lot of those specific details with a funeral plan. That's what I call the nitty gritty funeral planning. But what we're talking about today is not, do I want amazing grace or how great thou art? What we're talking is making sure that the architecture, that the actual foundation is there so that things are set and then they can go to the funeral provider and take care of some of the nitty and gritty.
Gotcha. Gotcha. So with this type of funeral pre-planning, who's when you're talking to a family, who's a prime candidate for that type of planning?
So I would say there's two different categories. I always like to refer to them as the general pre-planner and then the crisis pre-planner.
Okay.
The general pre-planning is going to be anyone who comes into your office. Um, Likely they have some assets that, and maybe they have a trust or will set up, um, and they are really protecting, and the biggest thing for them is peace of mind, ensuring that there's not only funds set aside that are protected for if life circumstances change and they would need to go onto Medicaid or something like that, but far more that the funds are there and readily accessible for the time of need, the death. A lot of people don't realize that the funeral costs are due immediately at the time of death, at the time of arrangement, which means, if my spouse died, and I went in for my wife's funeral arrangements, usually that's within 24 hours of the death. Um, the funds are due at that time because the funeral home needs to begin paying for all those other individuals, the florist, the obits, the cemetery, the gravedigger, this, that, or the other. Um, so oftentimes people will set aside funds to protect that. They in the general pre-planning category, also a lot of people like to take care of what's called um, authority for final disposition or the right of disposition. That's basically a funeral directive that allows people to describe and prescribe which method of disposition they would want, and then perhaps give certain people authority to enact that. A lot of people don't realize that at the time of death, our bodies are quasi property of our next of kin. So that means that if I die and my spouse is already predeceased, we have two children um, who are 18 years or older. That child, both children in the eyes of the law have equal authority to make funeral disposition decisions. So that obviously gets pretty interesting
Yeah.
when they have different perspectives, or they have different purchasing power, or they have different understanding of what mom or dad wanted. So that's, I would say, the general pre-planning. But then I'll also caveat into the crisis pre-planning. Um, and that would be for an individual who is either actively seeking medical assistance, Medicaid, or
Okay.
that's likely to come down the road. So those individuals are able to tuck aside funds, irrevocably assign them to a funeral trust, which is held by an insurance company. I always like to make sure, that that's explained well. So it's uh, an irrevocable funeral trust or a funeral expense trust is oftentimes the product that someone would use to protect those funds,
Yeah.
um, and they are accessible for the purposes of Medicaid.
So with the funeral expense trust specifically, if someone is looking to use that as a spend down strategy, how does the actual product work? If you have a client, let's say I'm the attorney, I send you my client, they purchase the funeral expense trust either through my office or through Krause. When the person passes away, what's the actual kind of logistical process in which those funds are accessed, and how does the family get those, and how does that all work with the product?
Yeah, great question. So I'll start before the
Please.
before the
Yeah.
death, Jim. So first of all, they're guaranteed issue. A lot of whole life products um, are going to require some sort of underwriting. Obviously, the intricacy of this policy demands that if the individual is 99 and in poor health, well, we can guarantee the issue because these are all single premiums. So we're just putting one lump sum of money, guaranteed policies. They're obviously backed by the insurance company, so they're principal guaranteed, but they also have some growth factor in them. So they're going to grow to help against inflation. Um, Basically, what would happen is that people would put the funds in there. It's not considered an asset for Medicaid purposes, which is the big benefit as well. Um, and then at the time of death, they, meaning the family, gets to choose any funeral provider they want.
Okay.
They go to the funeral provider, and then the insurance company pays them directly. So it's a really clean process for that. And then at that time, if there's remainders left in the policy, it would go back to the estate. And generally, states are going to um, have a prescribed manner of what those expenses, oftentimes in a recovery program,
Right.
that's going to go back for. So the funds are readily available, usually within 48, oftentimes even same day, 24 hours. So it's a really clean process, and helpful for the family.
Yeah, that's great. I think you've done a great job of explaining it, but could you give, I know attorneys love case studies and examples. Could you kind of walk through an example of a family that you've helped with a crisis planning? Like, how did that work in your office?
So the interesting thing is, some families or some states, pardon me, some states allow for an individual to not only purchase a funeral trust for themselves, but also for their spouse and sometimes even their children.
Right.
So we've had individuals, um, uh, Mary Alice would be, there's always a Mary Alice. So we're going to go with Mary Alice.
There you go.
Mary Alice has $100,000 of assets. She's actively seeking Medicaid application. She's able to put away $20,000 for herself for her funeral trust, 20 for her husband, and then even money for her kids. So rather than those funds, you know, going straight to the cost of her care, she's able to essentially pass those assets, protect those assets for her, her spouse, and or her children. Granted, each state's going to be different
Yeah.
on what they allow, maybe the amounts that they allow, or who they allow those assets to be passed to through a funeral trust. But that would be a great example of how we can capture, um, protecting those assets, but also making it beneficial for families. That's a real way that people, funeral expenses are not, receiving that is not like the most sexy way to receive assets from your grandmother or
That's not what
parent.
you had in mind, I bet, when you
I
were
know.
thinking, I'm gonna get some money from grandma. Well, you got your funeral expense
Exactly.
trust.
Like, yeah, your cremation, it's paid for. Um, But if we're being honest, this is a really meaningful way as well for families to pass something that we are guaranteed to use in life, right? It's also protected. So say there's a child that is a little spendthrift or he has some issues, in life. It's a way to protect these funds, guarantee that they're there to care for themselves at their time of need after death. So it's a meaningful product as well.
Yeah, and I've spent a lot of time in Medicaid manuals more than I'd like to admit, and there are also exclusions in most states for burial items as well. And
Yeah.
do you want to talk a little bit about how can you prepay for those things as well, or is that also included in the funeral expense trust, or would that be a separate um, spend down?
Great question. In most states, those are separate buckets.
Yeah.
I always like to kind of say there's the funeral services bucket, which is a general amount, and that's the funeral expense trust.
Okay.
So that can go towards things like a plot or like
They
a
say things like
donor.
urns and mausoleums,
Yeah,
pretty common
absolutely.
to see in there.
Yeah, but you're also able to have this other little pot in most states, and that's called a burial space item or a burial space exclusion. And that's the actual physical items, the urn, the mausoleum, you know, anything minus the funeral services. So in some states, we can even set aside additional funds for this, for the next of kin, or for that individual. So there's a lot of benefits again to being strategic around how do we pre-plan, how do we have these conversations with people, whether it's in crisis planning or not, because there's some real opportunity there for families to pre-plan and also to protect.
Yeah, and that pre-planned scenario with the burial spaces, how does the money get set aside there so it's excluded?
Great question. That would be in a similar policy.
Okay.
So basically, very similar to a funeral expense trust, we would call that a burial space item, but it's held through insurance companies, and made that way.
Excellent. Thank you. I think that when I'm looking through those, I do get confused between, okay, it
Yeah.
looks like there's two exclusions here, but I don't really know
Yeah.
the difference in how to hold that money. So I think it's
It
great to know there's two different buckets that
yeah.
attorneys can pre-plan for. And then if they're in the crisis planning situation, these are spend down that's really going to help the family. And it's a unique spend down because that money can be spent on family members rather than just the recipient of the care.
Yeah.
So I think that's great. Thank you so much for explaining that.
Yeah.
I think one thing, and this is where when I'm out in the wild talking to other elder law attorneys, we're always looking for how do I broaden my referral sources? How do I connect more with people that are going to be professionals that are going to be working with my clients or could benefit my clients? How can the attorney, the elder law attorney, work and benefit somebody that's in your career path, in someone who's in the death care industry? How can the attorney and the professional there kind of work together for a beneficial interest long term?
I love that. I love that question. If we could all have more synergy, right? I feel
Right.
like all of us would do better and be better. Um, I think the big thing, funeral professionals, very similarly to elder and estate professionals, are meet people at a critical juncture in their life, especially funeral professionals in pre-planning. Um, meet with a lot of people who are on either that general pre-planning sector or that crisis planning. So having a relationship with a funeral, either an advanced funeral planner or a funeral home, is almost always beneficial. The one thing that I'll say is sometimes sometimes we're siloed, and sometimes the connectivity, and even the language that we use is a little bit different. So just trying to break down those barriers and build a relationship always helps. Funeral homes never mind you talking about funeral planning. They actually appreciate it. It brings it to forefront of mind. Funeral homes further um, don't have issues with people having a life insurance policy or something like that and using them for the funeral. Because at the end of the day, that's one less conversation we have to have about funds. I, as a funeral director, I still get to practice very, very minimally. But when I sit with the family and I know that they have funds set aside for OMA, it like makes me feel better because what I can do is I can really spend more time caring for that family. Uh, we don't have to, people's emotions aren't quite as high because they know that things are being taken care of. And we can spend the appropriate due time worrying about how can we honor her well and how can I care for you well. So I think building that relationship, not being afraid of the specialty that you provide and also the differences that you have are really important bridges to that. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it just seems like there's a lot of commonality between the services that the elder law attorney and the funeral directors and these conversations. I think they just seem very, very similar and they cross a lot of paths. So when if you're getting a referral from an attorney, how would you like the attorney to kind of set up those expectations of what that conversation is going to be like? What would be the ideal referral that you'd be getting and receiving from an attorney? How would that look as far from the attorney side to how we can you up for success?
Yeah, as a funeral director, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I would say 2 ways. One is where, you've maybe already helped individuals with the right of disposition or have some of those initial conversations and or even maybe paid for some of the funds. Those are all conversations then that the funeral practitioner doesn't have to have. And it also then is beneficial. They don't have to dive quite as deep into, okay, well, this is you have these rights, this is how the law in the state works, et cetera, because you've already went there. So that's directly beneficial. The other area is where we kind of go through all of it and go deep into the weeds. Again, funeral potatoes conversation and, really prescribe it. I would say those are the two kind of scenarios that we would oftentimes receive them. And I think just general communication is really helpful. You know, hey, I have this family. Um, this is what they're interested in. This is what they already have going. Thanks for serving them. So every funeral home is different. Every funeral director is different, just like ever practice. But I think those are some general
That's
overarching.
awesome. I think that's really, really helpful to help attorneys kind of come at it from how can I help the funeral director? Because that's one thing that when I'm working with attorneys and doing the coaching that I've done, they always want to know how am I going to get a referral back? And I always try to have them change that mentality of how are you helping that other professional? Because
Love
that's going
that.
to come back to you 100 times. So thanks so much for sharing that and kind of try to flip that that mind frame of how am I going to get something out of it to how am I helping my fellow professional in the community that's going to come back 100 times.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
so we have an attorney, they have a client in their office, they want to do some crisis Medicaid planning. How do they work with Krause to be able to get this funeral trust in place? How does Krause kind of fit in the mix here?
Yeah, absolutely. So our big, again, earlier I said educate, equip, and resource, and that's really what we're here to do. So attorneys oftentimes contact us and say, "Hey, this is the scenario. What are their options for funeral products?" And we like to then be able to offer, these are the areas. It's always helpful if we have some context around their family, so there's a spouse, there's this much assets to play with, and this is what's important to them, so that we're able to go through that. I almost always recommend um, that you at least have a conversation and just say, do you want to be buried or cremated? Because that does help with a general price frame for us. But generally speaking, if they're in crisis planning, we want to make sure that we're capturing, um, sufficient funds. People don't realize this does not just have to go to funeral costs. It can go to luncheons. It can go to your family goes out for drinks the night before when everyone flew in, like those are all qualifiable expenses that fall under this funeral cost. So eating up the policy happens really quick. So I never want people to be like, oh well, that should be enough, because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we've really capitalized on that and that we've protected enough.
I think I'd like a second line at my funeral, so I'm gonna have to figure out how to pay for all those brass band players. Well, it sounds like what you're saying is that an attorney can work directly with Kraus to get a funeral expense trust in place if they don't have a relationship with the funeral director. Is that right?
Definitely. And even if they do have a relationship with a funeral director, we're not saying to avoid that relationship, but you're still able to help them get the financial aspect taken care of, and then have them go down to that funeral home.
Okay.
Have them have them talk with them about some of the nitty-gritty, but you're still able to provide a meaningful service and opportunity to connect with them about those products, get the policy in place, protect the funds, and then still go down to um, the provider. They're not mutually exclusive.
Awesome, awesome. David, thank you so much. This was illuminated my understanding. Like I said, when I'm reading those Medicaid manuals and I'm looking at those different buckets, I'm saying there's some potential here, but I don't quite understand what it is. So thank you so much for explaining that in a way that I think is really easy to understand and hopefully provides elder law attorneys an eye-opening moment where they say, hey, I can get involved in this planning. I can make sure those funds are set aside, and I can also use it as a Medicaid spend down if it's a crisis situation, if you don't have the luxury of doing it in pre-planning.
Definitely. Two last things, Jim. One
Please.
is it's very simple. Sometimes it can be overwhelming, like, what this is a new product. I just want to highlight the products are simple. We're here to make it, simple, stupid, just that it's easy for you, but also it's a meaningful product. Attorneys that I talk with that provide this, especially the products through us, talk about it all the time. We get regular feedback from them. That is out of any product, out of any planning piece that I talk about, this is a product and something that I can really connect with people on, because it's taking care of a very human need for people, taking care of them, making sure that they have their needs met in their final days. And that's, you connect with people on kind of this visceral level. And that is just building opportunity and the bonds of trust that so many of you already do. I'm remarkably thankful for um, the elder care and estate planning professionals who just meet family and community needs again and again. So just wanted to bookend with that.
No, I think that's great, and I know in my family, when my grandparents have passed away, they did have everything arranged, and it again, it took all that stress just away, and you were able to celebrate the life, go through the grieving process without having to worry about who's paying for it, how are we gonna get this money quickly, and all that. So it really is something that, again, brings that peace of mind, that quality of life, and can be a really great service for elder law attorneys. So if an attorney has a case, do they give you a call? How do they contact you? What's the easiest way to get in touch with you?
Yeah, absolutely. You're welcome to contact me here at any time. I try to make myself extremely accessible. So um,
Just give a
please
call at the office
reach
then?
out. Yeah, reach out to us here at the office, as well as if you just want to hear a little bit more about this specifically in regards to your practice or your state and how it could be included. Please reach out to me. I'd love to connect with you. But of course, our benefit planners and our benefit planning team that you likely have a relationship already with, if you work with Kraus, they're extremely well equipped to be able to handle all these and together, our teams are here to be a resource.
Awesome, awesome. I knew they would be. They're amazing people.
Aren't
So
they
they are.
incredible?
Thank you so much, Damon. Wonderful conversation. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you so much.